Detective Chief Inspector Marcus Hammond stood in the rain outside Buckingham Palace, his weathered hands gripping a manila envelope that could change everything. 25 years of loyal service to the Royal Protection Unit had taught him to trust facts over rumors, but the documents inside this envelope challenged everything he thought he knew about the monarchy's most controversial member. The call had come at 3 a.m. An anonymous source claimed to have evidence that Queen Camilla had been involved in activities that went far beyond palace intrigue during the final months of Queen Elizabeth's life. Hammond had dismissed it initially as another conspiracy theory from disgruntled royal watchers, but then the photographs arrived. Inside his car, Hammond spread the contents across his dashboard, bank statements showing unusual transfers, private correspondence between Camilla and unknown individuals, medical records that didn't match the official timeline of the late Queen's declining health. Most disturbing of all were the recorded phone conversations, digitally authenticated by Scotland Yard's technical team. Just hours earlier, the recordings revealed Camilla discussing arrangements and necessary measures in hushed tones with an unidentified man. The dates on these calls coincided exactly with the period when Queen Elizabeth had been hospitalized for what the palace described as mobility issues and fatigue. But the conversations suggested something far more sinister was taking place behind the closed doors of Windsor Castle. Hammond's phone buzzed with a text from his superior. "Handle this quietly. Royal family cannot know about investigation until we have concrete proof." The detective understood the implications. If these allegations proved true, it would be the biggest scandal in royal history, potentially bringing down the entire monarchy. As he drove through London's empty streets toward his office, Hammond couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. 3 black sedans had been following him since he left the palace grounds. His training told him to vary his route, but his instincts told him that whoever was behind this evidence drop wanted him to feel paranoid. They wanted him to understand the gravity of what he now possessed. The detective's mind raced through the possibilities. Had Camilla orchestrated events to accelerate her path to the throne? The timing was certainly convenient. Queen Elizabeth's sudden decline, King Charles's own health issues becoming more pronounced, and Camilla's increasing visibility and royal duties all seemed to align perfectly with someone who had been planning and waiting for the right moment. Hammond parked outside Scotland Yard and noticed the same 3 vehicles positioned strategically around the building. Either he was being protected, or he was being monitored to ensure he handled this investigation according to someone else's agenda. The truth was, at this point, he wasn't sure which scenario frightened him more. Inside his office, Hammond locked the door and began organizing the evidence chronologically. What emerged was a pattern of behavior that suggested careful planning over many months. Financial records showed payments to private medical consultants who weren't on any official royal physician lists. Travel records indicated secret meetings between Camilla and individuals with connections to pharmaceutical companies and private security firms. The most chilling piece of evidence was a handwritten note, apparently in Camilla's own writing, that simply read, "The old ways are ending. The future requires difficult decisions. History will vindicate those brave enough to act." The paper was dated just 2 weeks before Queen Elizabeth's final public appearance, when she had looked frail but still mentally sharp during her meeting with the Prime Minister. Hammond realized he was holding evidence of what could be the most carefully orchestrated palace coup in British history. But he also knew that proving royal involvement in anything approaching criminal activity would require more than suspicious documents and recorded conversations. He needed witnesses, additional corroboration, and most importantly, he needed to stay alive long enough to see justice served. The detective's computer chimed with an encrypted email from an address he didn't recognize. The message was brief: "There's more evidence, but you're running out of time. They know you have the files. Meet tomorrow at the location where Charles and Camilla first kissed publicly. Come alone and bring everything you've discovered so far. Trust no one in your department." Hammond stared at the screen, knowing that accepting this meeting could either provide the final pieces of evidence needed to expose the truth, or walk him directly into a trap that would silence him permanently. Outside his window, he could see the 3 black sedans still positioned in the street below, their occupants presumably waiting for his next move. The clock on his desk showed 4:47 a.m. In just a few hours, the palace would be buzzing with morning activities, and Camilla would begin another day as queen consort, completely unaware that a veteran detective was building a case that could destroy her carefully constructed royal image and potentially land her in prison for crimes against the crown itself. Detective Hammond arrived at Highgrove Gardens just as the morning mist was lifting from the perfectly manicured hedges. This was where Charles and Camilla had been photographed sharing their first public kiss decades ago, a moment that had scandalized the nation and forever changed the trajectory of the royal family. Now, it might become the location where the truth about their recent actions would finally come to light. A woman in her 60s approached from behind a rose trellis, her silver hair hidden beneath a dark scarf and her face partially obscured by oversized sunglasses. Despite her attempts at disguise, Hammond immediately recognized her as Lady Margaret Thornfield, former personal secretary to Queen Elizabeth and one of the few people who had maintained access to the monarch during her final months. "Inspector Hammond," she said quietly, her voice carrying the refined accent of decades spent in royal service. "I pray you've taken my warning seriously. What I'm about to share with you will shake the foundations of everything the British people believe about their royal family." Lady Margaret led him to a secluded bench overlooking the gardens where she had once arranged private meetings between Charles and Camilla during their forbidden romance. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they were now meeting to discuss potentially criminal activities involving the same couple, who had fought so hard for acceptance and legitimacy. "I was with Her Majesty every day during her final 6 weeks," Lady Margaret began, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. What the public was told about her gradual decline was carefully orchestrated fiction. The Queen was actually recovering well from her autumn illness until Camilla began taking a more active role in her daily care routine. Hammond pulled out his recording device, but Lady Margaret shook her head firmly. "Nothing electronic? What I'm telling you puts both our lives at risk? But someone must know the truth before it's too late." She glanced nervously around the gardens before continuing. Camilla convinced Charles that the Queen needed stronger medication for her discomfort. She brought in her own medical consultants, people who weren't on the official royal physician roster. I watched as these strangers administered treatments that made Her Majesty increasingly confused and weak. The detective felt his stomach tighten as the implications became clear. "Are you suggesting that Queen Camilla was deliberately harming Queen Elizabeth?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Lady Margaret replied coldly. "I'm telling you exactly what I witnessed." Camilla would arrive each morning with special tea blends and vitamin supplements that she claimed would help the Queen's energy levels. Within hours of consuming these, Her Majesty would become disoriented and need to rest for the remainder of the day. Lady Margaret reached into her handbag and retrieved a small glass vial filled with amber liquid. "This is from one of those vitamin supplements. I managed to save a sample before Camilla's people disposed of the remaining bottles after the Queen's passing." "Have it analyzed, Inspector? You'll find substances that no legitimate physician would ever prescribe to an elderly patient." Hammond carefully took the vial, his mind racing through the legal and political ramifications of what he was hearing. If Lady Margaret's accusations were true, they were discussing regicide, the murder of a monarch by another member of the royal family. The last time such charges had been seriously considered was over 500 years ago. "There's more," Lady Margaret continued. Camilla had private meetings with certain members of Parliament during the Queen's final weeks. These weren't official constitutional discussions about succession. I overheard phone conversations where she was discussing transitional arrangements and modernization initiatives that could only be implemented once Charles became king. The former royal secretary's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She was planning for the Queen's death, Inspector. making arrangements and forming alliances as if she already knew exactly when it would happen. No one prepares for such things unless they have inside knowledge of the timeline. Hammond felt the weight of centuries of British history pressing down on him. The monarchy had survived civil wars, world wars, and numerous scandals, but this allegation struck at the very heart of the institution's legitimacy. If Camilla had indeed hastened Queen Elizabeth's death to secure her own position as queen consort, it would destroy public faith in the royal family forever. "Why are you coming forward now?" Hammond asked. "Why didn't you speak up immediately after the Queen's death?" Lady Margaret's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Because I was terrified, and because I hoped I was wrong about what I had witnessed. But then I saw how quickly Camilla assumed her new role, how seamlessly all her plans fell into place. And I realized that my silence was making me complicit in covering up the greatest crime in British history." She stood to leave but turned back one final time. "Inspector, there are others who know pieces of this truth. Dr. Harrison, the night nurse who was mysteriously transferred to Scotland the day after the Queen's death. James Morton, the palace security guard who noticed unusual activity in the medical supply storage areas. Find them quickly, before they disappear like the medical records that were shredded within hours of the official announcement." As Lady Margaret walked away through the morning shadows, Hammond realized he was no longer investigating a possible crime. He was racing against time to prevent a cover-up that had already begun. Somewhere in London, Queen Camilla was going about her royal duties, completely unaware that the walls of deception she had carefully constructed were beginning to crumble around her. Dr. Sarah Harrison sat in the cramped back office of a rural Scottish clinic, her hands shaking as she read the morning newspapers. The headlines were filled with glowing reports of Queen Camilla's charitable work and her growing popularity among the British people. But Dr. Harrison knew a different story, one that had forced her to flee London and accept a position in this remote Highland village where she hoped no one would find her. Detective Hammond had tracked her down through NHS employment records, following a trail that led from Buckingham Palace's medical staff to a hastily arranged transfer that had raised red flags throughout the healthcare bureaucracy. When he knocked on her clinic door at closing time, Dr. Harrison's face went pale with terror. "I knew someone would eventually come asking questions," she whispered, quickly locking the door behind him and drawing the curtains. "I've been living in constant fear since that night, wondering when they would decide I knew too much to be allowed to continue living freely." Hammond studied the young physician's face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the nervous way she constantly glanced toward the windows. Dr. Harrison had been the Queen's night nurse during the final 2 weeks of her life, responsible for monitoring her vital signs and administering medications during the crucial overnight hours when most medical emergencies occurred. "Tell me what happened during those final nights," Hammond said gently, recognizing the signs of someone who desperately wanted to share a terrible burden but feared the consequences of speaking. Truthfully, Dr. Harrison moved to her desk and retrieved a locked metal box from the bottom drawer. Inside were photocopies of medical charts, medication schedules, and handwritten notes that should have been destroyed according to royal protocol. "I kept these because I knew something was terribly wrong, and I thought someday someone might need proof of what really happened." She spread the documents across her desk, pointing to a series of entries from the Queen's final week. "Look at these medication times and dosages. During the day shift, Her Majesty received standard treatments for her diagnosed conditions. But at night, when only Camilla and I were present, additional substances were being administered." Hammond examined the charts carefully, noting discrepancies between the official prescriptions and what had actually been given to the Queen. "These extra medications aren't signed off by any of the royal physicians. Who authorized these treatments?" "Camilla did," Dr. Harrison replied, her voice barely audible. "She claimed they were special supplements approved by a private consultant who was monitoring the Queen's progress remotely. She said the family wanted to try alternative treatments that weren't part of the traditional royal medical protocols." The doctor's hands trembled as she continued. I questioned the treatments because they seemed to make Her Majesty more confused and lethargic rather than helping her recovery. But Camilla insisted they were necessary and reminded me that she was speaking as the future Queen Consort, with the full authority of the Prince of Wales. Hammond felt his detective instinct sharpening. As the pieces of evidence began forming a clear picture, what exactly were these additional treatments? Dr. Harrison pulled out a separate sheet of paper covered with her own handwriting. High-dose sedatives disguised as pain medication, experimental blood thinners that dramatically increased the risk of internal bleeding, and something I couldn't identify, a clear liquid that Camilla administered personally and insisted I not record in the official medical charts. The implications hit Hammond like a physical blow. This wasn't just medical malpractice or well-intentioned alternative treatment. This was a systematic poisoning disguised as compassionate care. Did you ever see Queen Elizabeth lucid enough to consent to these treatments? That's what haunts me most, Dr. Harrison admitted, tears now flowing freely. During my day shifts, the Queen was often alert and conversational. She would ask about her family, discuss current events, and seem mentally sharp despite her physical weakness. But after the night treatments that Camilla supervised, she would be barely conscious for days at a time. Hammond leaned forward intently. Did Queen Elizabeth ever express concerns about her treatment or ask questions about her condition? Only once, and it terrified me, Dr. Harrison replied. 3 nights before she died, Her Majesty grabbed my arm while I was checking her pulse and whispered, "Sarah, I don't think I'm getting better. Something doesn't feel right." I promised her I would review her medications with the royal physicians, but when I tried to schedule a meeting, I was told that Camilla had decided to simplify the medical team and that my concerns should be directed through her. The doctor stood and walked to the window, staring out at the Scottish Highlands where she had been hiding for months. The next morning, I arrived for my shift to find that my access to the medical supplies had been restricted. Camilla informed me that she would be handling all medication administration personally from that point forward, and that my role would be limited to monitoring vital signs and reporting any changes to her directly. Hammond realized he was listening to an eyewitness account of regicide in progress. What happened during those final 48 hours? I wasn't allowed in the Queen's private chambers, Dr. Harrison said, her voice hollow with guilt and fear. Camilla stationed her own security personnel outside the door and claimed that the Queen had requested complete privacy during her final hours. I could hear medical equipment running, but I wasn't permitted to verify that it was being used properly. She turned back to face Hammond, her professional composure completely shattered. "Inspector, I became a doctor to save lives, not to stand by while someone was systematically murdered. But I was young, intimidated, and convinced that if I spoke up, I would be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist attacking the future Queen of England." Hammond carefully gathered the photocopied medical records, understanding that he now possessed evidence of premeditated murder committed at the highest levels of the British government. "Dr. Harrison, are you willing to testify officially about what you witnessed?" The young physician nodded slowly, though her face showed the terror she felt at the prospect. "I've been carrying this guilt for months, knowing that my silence makes me partially responsible for whatever happened in that room. If testifying can bring justice for Queen Elizabeth and prevent Camilla from harming anyone else, then I'll face whatever consequences come from telling the truth." As Hammond left the Scottish clinic with the most damning evidence yet against Queen Camilla, he realized that his investigation had crossed the point of no return. He was no longer gathering evidence for a possible case. He was building the foundation for a trial that would either expose the greatest royal crime in British history or destroy his own career and possibly his life. James Morton had been working palace security for 15 years, long enough to notice when normal routines were disrupted and security protocols were mysteriously altered. As Detective Hammond sat across from him in a dingy London pub, the burly security guard kept checking his watch and glancing toward the exits with the nervous energy of a man who knew too much for his own safety. They Move me to overnight parking duty the week after the funeral, Morton explained, his thick Cockney accent barely masking his anxiety. 15 years of royal protection service, and suddenly I'm not trusted to work inside the palace anymore. They claimed it was a routine rotation, but I know a demotion when I see one. Hammond studied the security officer's weathered face, noting the same haunted expression he had seen in Dr. Harrison and Lady Margaret. The investigation was revealing a pattern of witnesses who had been strategically repositioned or silenced after Queen Elizabeth's death, suggesting a coordinated effort to eliminate anyone who might question the official narrative. Tell me about the unusual activity you witnessed during the Queen's final weeks, Hammond prompted. Pulling out a small notebook to record the conversation, Morton took a long drink from his pint before answering. It started about 3 weeks before Her Majesty passed. Camilla began bringing in her own people, security consultants who weren't on any official royal protection roster. These blokes had access to areas of the palace that even senior staff weren't allowed to enter. The security guard leaned closer, lowering his voice despite the pub's noisy atmosphere. I was stationed outside the medical supply storage area when I noticed these new security people coming and going at odd hours. They were removing boxes of medical equipment and replacing them with identical-looking containers, but the serial numbers didn't match our inventory records. Hammond felt his pulse quicken as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Did you report these discrepancies to your supervisors? Course I did, Morton replied bitterly. Filed a proper security report and everything. But the next day I was called into the chief of security's office and told that Camilla had personally approved these equipment upgrades and that questioning her authority was grounds for immediate dismissal. The security officer pulled out his mobile phone and showed Hammond a series of photographs he had secretly taken during his night shifts. The images showed unmarked vehicles in the palace courtyard, men in medical scrubs carrying equipment cases, and most disturbing of all, Camilla herself supervising the transfer of materials in areas where she had no official reason to be present. This photo was taken at 2 a.m, 3 days before the Queen died, Morton said, pointing to an image of Camilla speaking quietly with a man in a white coat whom Hammond didn't recognize. She's standing next to the service entrance that leads directly to the royal medical facilities, holding what looks like a briefcase full of medical supplies. Hammond examined the photograph closely, noting the time stamp and the clear view of Camilla's face. This was potentially the most concrete evidence yet of her direct involvement in altering the Queen's medical care. Do you know who the man in the white coat is? Morton shook his head. Never seen him before that week, and never saw him again after the Queen's death. But I did manage to get a partial view of his vehicle registration when he left that morning. He handed Hammond a slip of paper with a license plate number written in careful block letters. The detective realized he now had a trail to follow that could lead directly to the mysterious medical consultants who had apparently helped Camilla carry out her plan. James, did you notice any other unusual activities during those final weeks? The communication blackouts, Morton replied immediately. Normal palace protocol requires constant communication between all security stations, but during the Queen's final 72 hours, entire sections of the communication system were mysteriously offline for maintenance. Convenient timing, if you ask me. Morton's expression grew even more troubled as he continued. I was working the overnight shift when the Queen actually passed away. According to our standard procedures, the entire security team should have been immediately notified to implement lockdown protocols. But somehow, the official announcement wasn't made until nearly 6 hours after it actually happened. Hammond leaned forward intently. What happened during those 6 hours? That's what's been eating at me for months, Morton admitted. I saw vehicles coming and going from the medical wing throughout the night. People were removing equipment, shredding documents, and thoroughly cleaning areas that should have been preserved as part of the official record. By the time the formal announcement was made, any evidence of what really happened in that room had been systematically eliminated. The security officer's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Inspector, I've worked royal protection long enough to know the difference between standard procedures and a cover-up operation. What I witnessed during those final days wasn't normal palace protocol. It was the careful execution of a plan that had been prepared well in advance. Hammond absorbed this information, understanding that Morton's testimony provided crucial corroboration for the accounts he had already gathered from Lady Margaret and Dr. Harrison. The security guard's professional training and years of experience made him a particularly credible witness to the operational aspects of what appeared to be a sophisticated conspiracy. Are you prepared to make an official statement about what you witnessed? Hammond asked. Morton nodded grimly. I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions for months. I became a security officer to protect the royal family, not to help cover up crimes committed against them. If testifying helps bring justice for Queen Elizabeth, then I'm ready to face whatever consequences come from telling the truth. As they prepared to leave the pub, Morton grabbed Hammond's arm with surprising intensity. Inspector, there's something else you need to know. I wasn't the only security officer who noticed these irregularities. 3 other guards filed similar reports about unusual activities during the Queen's final weeks. Hammond felt a chill run down his spine. Where are these other guards now? Morton's face went pale. That's the thing that's been keeping me awake at night. 2 of them were transferred to overseas assignments immediately after the funeral. The third one, Tommy Richardson, was found dead in his flat last month. Official cause of death was listed as accidental overdose. But Tommy never touched drugs or alcohol in the 15 years I knew him. As Hammond left the pub with Morton's evidence and testimony, he realized that his investigation had uncovered not just a murder plot, but an ongoing cover-up operation that was systematically eliminating witnesses who could threaten Queen Camilla's position. The stakes had escalated far beyond solving a historical crime he was now racing to prevent additional murders and expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the British government. Detective Hammond sat in his locked office at Scotland Yard, surrounded by evidence that painted an increasingly dark picture of Queen Camilla's rise to power. The laboratory analysis of the liquid sample provided by Lady Margaret had confirmed his worst fears. It contained a cocktail of substances that would slowly induce heart failure while mimicking natural age-related decline. The license plate number from James Morton had led to a rental car company with falsified registration documents. But security cameras had captured clear images of the mysterious medical consultant entering and leaving the palace. Hammond's phone rang, interrupting his review of the evidence. The caller ID showed a blocked number, but when he answered, he recognized the trembling voice of Dr. Sarah Harrison calling from Scotland. Inspector, they found me, she whispered urgently. 2 men in dark suits came to the clinic this morning asking questions about my time at the palace. I managed to slip out the back entrance, but they're definitely looking for me. I think my life is in danger. Hammond felt his stomach drop. The systematic elimination of witnesses was accelerating, which meant that someone inside the investigation had leaked information about his activities. Dr. Harrison, where are you now? I'm calling from a payphone in Edinburgh. I've been thinking about everything I witnessed, and I remembered something that might be crucial to your investigation. Hidden in my personal belongings, I have video recordings from the palace security cameras during the Queen's final night. Hammond's pulse quickened. Video evidence would provide the definitive proof needed to prosecute Queen Camilla for regicide. How did you obtain these recordings? As the night nurse, I had access to the medical monitoring station that included security feeds from the Queen's private chambers. When I realized something terrible was happening, I used my phone to record portions of the security monitors. The footage shows exactly what Camilla was doing during those final hours when no other witnesses were present. The detective's mind raced through the implications. Video evidence of Camilla administering unauthorized treatments would be nearly impossible to dispute or explain away as misunderstanding or alternative medicine. Dr. Harrison, I need you to get to the nearest police station and request protective custody immediately. Don't trust anyone except uniformed officers in a public police facility. Inspector, there's something else, Dr. Harrison continued, her voice growing more frightened. I've been monitoring news reports since I fled to Scotland, and I've noticed that other people connected to the Queen's final days have been dying under suspicious circumstances. The official explanations all sound plausible individually, but taken together they suggest someone is systematically eliminating potential witnesses. Hammond pulled up his computer files and cross-referenced the names of everyone he had identified as having access to the Queen during her final weeks. The pattern that emerged was chilling. 7 people with direct knowledge of the medical treatments had died, disappeared, or been transferred to remote locations within 6 months of Queen Elizabeth's death. Dr. Harrison, listen to me carefully, Hammond said, his voice urgent with authority. I believe you're right about the danger you're facing, but I also believe those video recordings represent the key evidence needed to expose the truth about Queen Elizabeth's death. Are you willing to risk returning to London under police protection to help us build a case against Queen Camilla? The line was silent for several long moments before Dr. Harrison responded. Inspector, I became a doctor to preserve life, and my failure to prevent what happened to the Queen has been destroying me with guilt for months. If those recordings can bring justice and prevent Camilla from harming anyone else, then yes, I'm willing to risk everything to ensure they reach the proper authorities. Hammond arranged for armed police escort to transport Dr. Harrison safely back to London. But as he made the arrangements, he realized that his own position had become increasingly precarious. The same forces that had been eliminating witnesses would undoubtedly target him. Once they realized how much evidence he had accumulated, that evening, Hammond received an encrypted email from an unknown sender with a simple message. The recordings Dr. Harrison mentioned show more than just medical treatment. Camilla wasn't acting alone, and the conspiracy reaches higher than you realize. Meet me at midnight at the location where Queen Victoria's statue overlooks the Thames. Come alone and bring copies of everything you've discovered. This is your only chance to understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. Hammond stared at the message, recognizing that he was being drawn into what could be either the final revelation that would complete his investigation or a trap that would end his life. The location specified was Victoria Embankment Gardens, a public space that would provide some protection but also offer multiple escape routes for anyone planning an ambush. As midnight approached, Hammond made copies of all his evidence and left detailed instructions with his most trusted colleague about how to proceed if he failed to return from the meeting. He understood that his investigation had reached a critical juncture where the truth about Queen Camilla's crimes would either be fully exposed or permanently buried along with the witnesses who could testify to her guilt, walking through London's dark streets toward the Thames. Hammond reflected on how his routine investigation had evolved into a confrontation with the most powerful people in Britain. Queen Camilla had demonstrated that she was willing to commit murder to achieve her ambitions, and she clearly possessed the resources and connections necessary to eliminate anyone who threatened her position. The detective's hand rested on the concealed recording device in his jacket pocket, knowing that whatever revelations awaited him at the statue of Queen Victoria might be his last opportunity to gather the evidence needed to bring justice for Queen Elizabeth and prevent additional crimes against the Crown. As he approached the shadowy gardens along the Thames, Hammond prepared himself for a confrontation that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the British monarchy itself. The figure waiting in the shadows beneath Queen Victoria's statue was not what Detective Hammond had expected. Instead of another frightened witness or mysterious informant, he found himself facing Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, the private secretary to King Charles himself. The distinguished gentleman's presence in this clandestine meeting suggested that the conspiracy Hammond had been investigating reached even deeper into the royal establishment than he had imagined. Inspector Hammond, Sir Geoffrey said quietly, his refined voice carrying decades of authority within the palace hierarchy. I apologize for the dramatic circumstances of this meeting. But the information I need to share with you is too dangerous to discuss through normal channels. Hammond approached cautiously, his hand positioned near the emergency beacon that would summon backup officers if the situation became threatening. Sir Geoffrey, what is your involvement in this investigation? The private secretary's face showed the strain of someone carrying an enormous burden of knowledge. I've been conducting my own quiet inquiry into the circumstances surrounding Her Majesty's death, Inspector. What you've discovered through your investigation confirms suspicions that have been troubling King Charles and myself for several months. Hammond felt his worldview shift as he realized that the king himself might be aware of his wife's potential crimes. Is King Charles involved in covering up Queen Camilla's activities? Sir Geoffrey shook his head emphatically. Quite the opposite, Inspector. His Majesty has been increasingly suspicious about the rapid changes in his mother's condition during her final weeks, but he's been unable to investigate openly without triggering a constitutional crisis that could destroy the monarchy entirely. The private secretary pulled out a sealed envelope and handed it to Hammond. These are copies of private correspondence between King Charles and his mother's physicians, expressing concerns about unauthorized medical treatments and requesting independent medical evaluations that were repeatedly denied or delayed. Hammond examined the documents by the light of his phone, noting that they were dated throughout the period when Queen Elizabeth's health was allegedly declining. King Charles had apparently been fighting behind the scenes to ensure his mother received proper medical care, but his efforts had been systematically blocked by Camilla's increasing control over the Queen's treatment protocols. Inspector, there's something else you need to understand about the scope of this conspiracy, Sir Geoffrey continued. Camilla wasn't acting alone in planning Queen Elizabeth's death. She had the support of a faction within Parliament who believed that accelerating the succession would provide stability during a period of economic uncertainty. Hammond felt the case expanding beyond a simple murder investigation into a complex political conspiracy. Are you telling me that members of Parliament were involved in planning regicide? Not directly, Sir Geoffrey replied carefully. But they provided Camilla with the financial resources and political protection necessary to carry out her plan. The same network that helped her eliminate witnesses after the Queen's death has been working to ensure that no official investigation could ever reach the level of evidence you've accumulated. The private secretary's expression grew even more grave as he continued. Inspector, your investigation has been monitored from the beginning. Camilla's supporters within the security services have been tracking your activities and systematically eliminating witnesses before you could gather their testimonies. Dr. Harrison and James Morton are both in immediate danger, and your own life is at risk now that you've assembled enough evidence to threaten the conspiracy. Hammond realized that his careful investigation had been compromised from the start, which explained why witnesses kept disappearing and why he had felt constantly observed throughout his inquiries. Why are you sharing this information with me now? Sir Geoffrey pulled out a second document, an official royal warrant bearing King Charles's personal seal. Because His Majesty has decided that protecting the monarchy requires exposing the truth about his wife's crimes, even if it means facing the political consequences of her actions, this warrant authorizes you to arrest Queen Camilla on charges of regicide and conspiracy against the crown. Hammond stared at the warrant, understanding that he was holding what might be the most significant legal document in modern British history. A sitting monarch was authorizing the arrest of his own wife for murdering his mother, a scenario that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. There's one final piece of evidence that will complete your case, Sir Geoffrey said, handing Hammond a digital storage device. These are the complete medical records from Queen Elizabeth's final weeks, including the real treatment protocols and the actual substances that were administered to her. The evidence proves definitively that she was systematically poisoned over a period of several weeks. The private secretary checked his watch nervously. Inspector, Camilla has become aware that Dr. Harrison survived and is returning to London with video evidence. She's planning to eliminate both Dr. Harrison and yourself tonight before you can present your evidence to the authorities. Armed operatives are already positioning themselves around Scotland Yard and the safe house where Dr. Harrison is being held. Hammond felt the investigation reaching its climax as all the evidence finally came together into an irrefutable case against Queen Camilla. But he also realized that gathering evidence would be meaningless if he couldn't survive long enough to present it in court and if the key witnesses were eliminated before they could testify. Sir Geoffrey, what is King Charles's plan for handling the constitutional crisis that will result from arresting the Queen Consort for regicide? The private secretary's response chilled Hammond to the bone. His Majesty is prepared to abdicate the throne if necessary to ensure that justice is served for his mother's murder. He believes that preserving the moral authority of the monarchy is more important than protecting any individual member of the royal family, even himself. As Sir Geoffrey disappeared back into the London shadows, Hammond realized that he was no longer just investigating a crime. He was participating in a royal power struggle that would determine the future of the British constitutional system. The evidence in his possession could either restore faith in royal justice or trigger the collapse of the thousand-year-old monarchy, depending on how skillfully he could navigate the dangerous final phase of his investigation. Detective Hammond raced through London's empty streets toward Scotland Yard, knowing that Queen Camilla's operatives were already moving to eliminate him and Dr. Harrison before the evidence could be presented to the courts. The royal warrant authorizing Camilla's arrest felt like it was burning through his jacket pocket as he coordinated with armed response teams to secure the safe house where Dr. Harrison was waiting with her crucial video recordings. His phone buzzed with an urgent message from the protection detail. Safe house compromised. Dr. Harrison extracted safely, but 2 suspects down. Moving to secondary location. Video evidence secure. Hammond's heart pounded as he realized how close they had come to losing the final piece of evidence needed to prosecute Queen Camilla. The video recordings that Dr. Harrison had risked her life to preserve would show exactly what had happened during Queen Elizabeth's final hours when no other witnesses were present. At Scotland Yard, Hammond found his office surrounded by armed police officers and senior officials from the Crown Prosecution Service, who had been hastily assembled to review the evidence. Dr. Harrison sat in the corner, pale but determined, clutching a tablet containing the video files that would either convict a queen or destroy the investigator who dared to accuse her. "Inspector Hammond," announced the chief Crown Prosecutor, "we've reviewed the preliminary evidence you've gathered. And while the allegations are extraordinary, the documentation appears to support charges of regicide against Queen Camilla. However, before we can proceed with an arrest warrant, we need to verify the authenticity of these video recordings." Dr. Harrison stepped forward, her medical training evident in her precise, professional manner of speaking. The recordings show Queen Camilla administering unauthorized injections to Her Majesty during the final night of her life. The timestamps correspond exactly with the period when the Queen's vital signs showed the most dramatic deterioration. As the video played on the large screen, the room fell into stunned silence. The footage clearly showed Camilla entering Queen Elizabeth's private chamber alone, carrying a medical kit that contained substances not authorized by any of the royal physicians. Most damning of all, the audio recorded her speaking quietly to the unconscious Queen. "This is necessary for the future of the monarchy, Your Majesty. History will understand that difficult times require decisive action." Hammond watched the faces of the legal officials as they absorbed the full implications of what they were witnessing. This wasn't circumstantial evidence or suspicious documentation. This was clear visual proof of Queen Camilla deliberately administering substances that caused Queen Elizabeth's death. "Inspector," said the chief Crown Prosecutor, "this evidence is sufficient to support charges of regicide. But arresting a sitting Queen Consort will trigger the greatest constitutional crisis in British history. Are you prepared for the political consequences of your investigation?" Before Hammond could respond, his phone rang with a call from Buckingham Palace. King Charles himself was on the line, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision he was about to announce to the nation. Inspector Hammond, I have reviewed the evidence you've gathered about my wife's actions, and I am prepared to support her prosecution to the full extent of the law. I will be addressing the nation in 1 hour to explain the situation and to announce my decision regarding the future of the monarchy. Hammond realized that the investigation had reached its conclusion, but the real drama was just beginning. Within the hour, the British people would learn that their queen consort was being arrested for murdering the beloved Queen Elizabeth, and that King Charles was willing to sacrifice his own reign to ensure justice was served. As armed officers prepared to serve the arrest warrant at Buckingham Palace, Hammond reflected on how his routine investigation had uncovered the greatest royal scandal in British history. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were protected, and the legal system was finally ready to hold even the most powerful people accountable for their crimes. Queen Camilla was arrested that evening in the private apartment she had shared with King Charles, surrounded by the luxury and privilege she had been willing to kill to obtain. The charges read against her included regicide, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice, crimes that carried the possibility of life imprisonment and would forever change the British monarchy. King Charles's televised address to the nation was watched by millions around the world as he explained his decision to support his wife's prosecution despite the personal and political costs. The crown must stand for justice above all else, he declared. No one, regardless of their position or relationship to the throne, is above the law that protects every British citizen. The trial that followed would captivate global attention as Dr. Harrison, James Morton, and Lady Margaret testified about the systematic conspiracy that had led to Queen Elizabeth's murder. The video evidence proved conclusively that Camilla had deliberately ended the Queen's life to accelerate her own rise to power. Hammond's investigation had not only solved the crime but had also demonstrated that the British legal system could hold even royalty accountable for their actions. Queen Camilla was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, while King Charles's decision to support justice over family loyalty actually strengthened public faith in the monarchy's commitment to moral leadership. The detective, who had started with a simple anonymous tip, had ended up redefining the relationship between royal privilege and legal accountability, ensuring that Queen Elizabeth's death would be remembered not just as the end of an era, but as the moment when British justice proved it could reach even the highest levels of power and privilege.